So I've talked about the top of the chart and the bottom of the chart. Let me focus on the middle of the chart. Assuming that the offeror's proposals are acceptable, and that's how those top 373 are evaluated. It's either pass-fail, acceptable or unacceptable. You get to the green part of this chart, which essentially is the assessment of price. And each offeror proposes a price. Those prices will be calculated based on present value. They'll be adjusted based on a few criteria listed below. The Integrated Air Refueling Assessment, the FARA adjustment, talks about fuel delivery at range in various scenarios. Fuel burn adjustment is interesting. It's just fuel burn based on some set scenarios with a heavy emphasis actually on training, touch and goes, rather than the set of scenarios that reflect more operational type requirements for the aircraft. And MILCON essentially reflects the size and the footprint and the placement of the aircraft. But again, MILCON is a very interesting thing in that if you've had experience with it, MILCON plans go for decades, and essentially MILCON plans rotate for bases and they move forward regarding capability for a range of aircraft and functions. So our perspective is very simple. The first 373, pass-fail, I guess I'll assume that we're going to pass. I'll make the assumption that our competitor will pass, which means you quickly get past that gate into cost and price. And from that, you essentially have a regimen that's fairly simple. Total proposed price. I called it a cost shootout, but total proposed price. To frame a process kind of perspective here, it's so easy a calculator could do it. That's really the assessment process that this source selection, this draft RFP focuses on. This is a mathematical approach to buying capability for the warfighter, capabilities as defined by those 373 threshold requirements. So what does this really mean when I look at a capabilities perspective? Before we had high-value capability and other capability. Now, if you go to the next slide, we have this. Anybody remember this? This is the poster that some folks had in college. So I won't ask you to stare at the center of it. And I don't mean to be facetious, but the reality is this is the way the requirements are now arrayed. Compare that to the last pie chart, which I'll do in a minute here. Everything's equal. The printer for the aircrew, fuel offload rate, lavatory waste flow, past performance, protection. All these things are equal in value. And so the perspective is, if everything's important, is anything important? How can you value and select valued warfighter for the valued warfighter capability if everything is equal in importance? Let me contrast that in the next slide. So before and after. So this is where we were on the left, and this is where we are today. And to me, this is the meat of the warfighter capability question. So on the left, you see we had where we were, the assessment process. We had the 9 KPPs, which essentially translated into 37 mandatory requirements if you look at the sub-elements. Today, there are no KPPs. As an acquisition person, it's not clear to me I've ever encountered an acquisition with no KPPs. We have 373 mandatory threshold requirements, but again, everything weighted equally. From a capabilities and performance perspective, not quite sure what that gets you if you never pass that 1% gate and get to the valued warfighting capability that the warfighter really needs. Risk. Why is risk important? Last time risk was considered as part of the evaluation process, and this time risk is essentially pass-fail. There's no risk assessment for cost, schedule, or the ability to satisfy performance. So what does that really mean? How does the government protect its interest from an offeror coming in and essentially lowballing a bid? How do they determine the reasonableness of that bid and take action in the source selection process to possibly adjust that bid or adjust the perspective of the source selection to consider that risk, to protect the government's interests. That appears to be omitted from this process. And then contract structure. And we lay out here some particulars in terms of engineering, manufacturing, development. Last time you may remember the four developmental aircraft were essentially cost plus incentive nature, a cost plus structure to work through the developmental aspects of the aircraft, and then a fixed price type of a contract for the first lots, and then budgetary, if you will, budgetary numbers, projections regarding the balance of lots for the program. This is very, very different. This is an 18-year fixed price contract, including a fixed price structure even for development. Now, fixed price is interesting. If you look at fixed price in the context of acquisition reform, fixed price is essentially applied to things that are known, where the risk is minimal. But acquisition reform really has to do with balance of risk and allocation of risk. And here, by approaching this as a fixed price effort, the assumption appears to be that this is a low-risk effort. And while the 373 requirements, you could argue they're requirements that can be accomplished, I said, we'll assume that everyone will satisfy the 373. There is developmental risk. A portion of these requirements are not on our aircraft today. I'm not sure about our competitor, but my guess is they have the same challenge, where a portion of these requirements really are developmental in nature. There's also concurrency. You have development, and you have the first few lots of production aircraft overlap to a certain extent. And so there's concurrency risks. Things that you learn out of the developmental portion of the program will overlap with the first few lots of aircraft that are produced during low-rate production. So the question is, in a fixed-price environment where cost is fixed, price is fixed, if you will, and scope is fixed, that really limits the government's ability to make changes unless the government wants to reopen a sole-source negotiated contract. My guess is that'll be a very expensive proposition to do that. Or the government can keep the baseline fixed for 18 years, keep the budget fixed for 18 years, and in the end, assess the gap between the product that's delivered and the baseline warfighting capability, the valued capability that was articulated in the white papers, articulated as the game-changing requirements 18 years prior. That's the challenge of an 18-year fixed-price contract. Next slide. I tried to articulate what this really means in terms of where you were versus what you're going to get to. Everybody is familiar with the spider chart. Again, it wouldn't be a briefing without the spider chart. And so let me discuss the three different lines here. The blue outside is what the Air Force bought last time. That was our offering. That was what selected. What was selected, you see the quantity of fuel offloaded range, number of pallets, max payload in tons. Everything is there. The KC-135 is the green line or green pattern that's on the inside. That's what they have today. Our perspective is those 373 threshold requirements drive both offerers to get as close as possible to the red pattern. And so, as the government said during its presentation, when they initially briefed the RFP, KC-135 is the baseline. KC-135 is the baseline, and this is why it's the baseline. If you were able to build a new KC-135 today competitively, you could win this competition. And so the question from a warfighter perspective is, what happened to all that opportunity space? Everything that they bought last time. Everything they bought last time at a very competitive price. How do they get that today?